Christ is risen.
He is risen indeed.
Christos voskrese.
Oistino voskrese.
Christos anesti.
Alethos anesti.
On behalf of our Archbishop, His Eminence William Skurla, President of Saints Cyril and Methodius Byzantine Catholic Seminary, its board, and its rector, the Very Reverend Robert Pipta, I, Father Christian Kappas, Academic Dean of Saints Cyril and Methodius Byzantine Catholic Seminary, welcome you to the annual Cyril and Methodius Lecture as the culminating intellectual moment of our seminarians and master students' intellectual formation each academic year. Every even year in our calendar, we invite an Orthodox speaker to present to our faculty, students, and guests, while during the odd number years, as with this year, 2023, we anticipate a speaker from the Catholic communion of churches. This year, it is my pleasure to present Father John Baldwin, S.J. Father John is a professor of historical and liturgical theology at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. He is a priest of the USA East Province of the Society of Jesus. He received his B.A. from the College of the Holy Cross and MDiv from Weston School of Theology and M.A., M.Phil, and Ph.D. from Yale University. Father John has taught at Fordham University, the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley from 1999 to 2008, at Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge in Massachusetts, and now at BC at Boston College's STM. He has also been visiting professor at the University of Notre Dame and St. John Vianney National Seminary in Pretoria, South Africa. He served on the advisory committee for the Bishops' Committee on the Liturgy of the USCCB from 1989 to 1993, as well as the advisory committee on the International Commission on English in the Liturgy, or ICEL, from 1994 to 2002. He is past president of the North American Academy of Liturgy, as well as the International Ecumenical Societas Liturgica. He received the Baraka Award for Distinguished Achievement from the NAAL in 2007. He was president of the International Jungmann Society for Jesuits and the Liturgy from 2019 to 2022. He has served on the Board of Trustees of the College of the Holy Cross and currently serves on the Board of Trustees of Fairfield University. He is also a member of the Board of Directors of the journal Theological Studies. His fields of expertise are the history and theology of the liturgy, sacramental theology, and the theology of ministry, whether ordained or lay. Father John assists on weekends at Catholic parishes in Cambridge and Lexington. He has published on liturgy widely in journals including Worship, Theological Studies, America, and Commonweal. His writings have been translated into French, German, Spanish, Italian, Japanese, and Albanian. Father John's publications include The Urban Character of Christian Worship, The Origins, Development, and Meaning of Stational Liturgy from the Pontifical Institute of Oriental Studies in 1987, Living Bread, Saving Cup, Understanding the Mass, Rowan and Littlefield, 2003, Reforming the Liturgy, A Response to the Critics, Liturgical Press, 2008, and Catholic Sacraments, edited with David Turnblum, Paulus Press, 2015. He has also co-edited a commentary on the Revised Order of Mass with Mary Collins, Edward Foley, and Joanne Pierce in 2009. From the year 2020 to 2021, he published a two-part article on Mass intentions in theological studies. I now leave this virtual window to Father John to present us with his lecture, quote, Making the City a Church, Liturgical Processions in Constantinople from the 6th to the 10th centuries, end quote. Welcome, Father John.
Thank you, Father Christian. Can everybody see me? Am I up on your screen now?
Yes.
Good. Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you all. Thank you, Father Christian. Please allow me to begin. Well, first of all, I'll share my screen to this. I knew I should have done this before to make sure that my PowerPoint was up on the screen. There we go. Good. There we are. Good. You can see it now, can you? Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. Okay, great. Good. Thank you. So there's obviously the title of my lecture. I'm very grateful to Father Robert Pipta and your dean, Father Christian Kappas, for your gracious invitation to participate in this distinguished series. When I surveyed the names of your past lecturers, I was indeed humbled and honored to be included in such distinguished company. This past semester, I taught a seminar on medieval liturgy, Western liturgy. Naturally, our focus was on the Latin West, and particularly the Roman Rite. But in the course of the semester, it gradually became clearer and clearer, both to me and to the rest of the students, that when we study the elements of liturgy historically, we are entering into a comprehensive worldview, and that to truly understand these elements, it is useful, even necessary, to appreciate them in their cultural and historical context. It seems to me that this is indeed the case with the liturgical processions that are the subject of my lecture tonight. It would be impossible to understand and appreciate the liturgical processions of Constantinople without adverting to the role that so many of them played in the history and historical memory of that great city. Some of you will call probably New York the city, but the Byzantines called it the cities, the city. The city is precisely what the Turks came to call the city they conquered in 1454, Istanbul, a corruption of Istinpolin in Greek. Here is the city, as it is obviously reconstructed in its Middle Byzantine period. I'll have more to say about various facets of the city as we go on, but I'm not sure if you could see my cursor. But here is on the lower right is the Hagia Sophia, the great church, and then as you move up, past the palace complex on the main street, the round figure here is the Forum of Constantine, and then Main Street, or the Mese, goes all the way out to the city walls. I plan to proceed this way. First, I will discuss liturgical processions in general. How are they defined? What are the various types of procession? That's 1 and 2, definition and typology. Next I will deal thirdly with liturgical processions in Constantinople. That's the bulk of the lecture. And then fourth, I'm going to try to suggest some relevance that this has for all of us. Is this merely something that is of historical interest, valuable in that sense for us this evening, or does it have some relevance for all of us? And I'm going to try to argue a bit of relevance, and I'd love to hear your comments and reflections on it. So let me turn to definitions. A longer definition is given by Luke Lavin in a spectacular 2-volume work called Public Space in the Late Antique City. He says this: processions are defined as any collective street movement which involved an element of representation, whether it came from the participant or the observer, being manifested in stylized actions or reactions. We would probably want to say ritualized, such as chanting, singing, adopting a special costume, or marching formation. I think that's a pretty good broad definition. My own, from my book, The Urban Character, which Father Christian mentioned, is rather simple and brief. Organized or physical movements of people from one place to another for social, civil, or religious purposes. The processions we're considering this evening fall under the category, of course, of religious purposes. And even though I've subtitled the presentation Liturgical Processions in Constantinople, I want to suggest, I want to acknowledge some flexibility for the term liturgical. It's important to note, and it's a crucial part of my argument actually in this lecture, that the categories social, civil, and religious overlap. See figures of the gods there in this triumphal procession of Julius Caesar into the city of Rome. Let me add the very useful definition of the ritual specialist Ronald Grimes. He says this: processions are the linearly ordered solemn movement of a group through chartered space to a known destination, to give witness, bear an esteemed object, we'll see that in the case of relics, perform a rite, fulfill a vow, gain merit, or visit a shrine. The practice of processing reaches deep into human history. It involves important social occasions like weddings and funerals. It also involves civic occasions like the ritual that surrounded kingship or the arrival of a king, an important person, or even the image of a king into the city. That's something that we call technically the Adventus. And this is a form of Adventus, the triumphal entry of Julius Caesar into Rome. Processions could even be daily events like the procession of a patrician in Rome, accompanied by his clientele. Processions are characteristic of religious practice, both outside of sacred spaces and within them. They can be either occasional, weddings and funerals, or regularly scheduled, feasts, fasts, commemorations. The latter will be the focus of this lecture. Pilgrimages are closely related to religious or liturgical processions since they involve journeys to a sacred place and often the circumambulation of those places. In fact, I'd characterize the practice of circumambulation under the broader category of religious processions. As far as I can tell, circumambulation is found in every religion. The clearest example, of course, is the circumambulation around the Kaaba in Mecca, especially here it's pictured during the end of the Hajj. And there are many processions in the course of the Hajj, as you can see on the right side of the screen. Indeed, the Arabic word Hajj, related to its Hebrew cognate, Hag, both derive their meaning from circumambulation. Think of the importance of the newly married couple around the altar in a Byzantine wedding liturgy. That's a circumambulation. Or the circular processions within Anglican churches on certain occasions, like the first Sunday of Advent, or British medieval processions, which often circled the church externally. For example, here in a reconstruction of a procession around the Cathedral of Salisbury in England. On the other hand, I realize that circumambulation is not linear, and I've said processions tend to be linear, but allow me some leeway. Allow me one more note with regard to the liturgical meaning of circumambulation. We are all familiar, no doubt, with the image of a ziggurat. Here's one from the Middle East, which, like the Tower of Babel, provides a circulatory or circumambulatory path while reaching up to the heavens. Perhaps we're not so familiar with the fact that the ziggurat falls into another very important cultural category, what's called the stupa, which is often a burial mound. Here you find one from India, and of course the version of the stupa that is further in East Asia is a pagoda. It's the same thing as a ziggurat. Now let me move to typology. I have my own particular typology that I'll get to in a second. A number of typologies have been proposed as intelligibility constructs for processions. Hermann Wegmann, for example, has divided them into personage-centered and participatory. A good example of the personage-centered one was the triumph of Julius Caesar. Another would be the translation of relics, as in this famous ivory, the so-called Trier ivory from Constantinople in the late 4th century. If you can see on the right here, you have the emperor and his wife leading the procession. It's a personage centered in the sense that it's a procession with relics. We're not sure who the relics are or exactly which church the relics are being delivered to, processed to, but they are being processed with in an imperial and liturgical procession. Okay. Although this simple differentiation might do, that is to say, between personage-centered and participatory, I have adopted Wegmann's taxonomy, but I've qualified it a little bit by further subdividing it, as you can see on the screen, into participatory processions that are both supplicatory and mimetic. Mimetic would be something that imitates, like the Palm Sunday procession in Jerusalem. One example of a supplicatory procession is, well, here's a transfer of the relics of St. John Chrysostom, which is from the Menologion of Basil II. I'm sorry, I don't have the color pictures of this. Here is the Great Litany, which is another major supplicatory procession asking God's favor, especially on the crops here in spring, right in Rome, which took place on April the 25th. This practice, the practice of the Great Litany, spread throughout the medieval West. A good example is the supplicatory procession for the Byzantine, the supplicatory procession on the occasion of the earthquake and hail of cinders in Constantinople on November 6th, 447. That procession began at the Forum of Constantine, which I showed you before, and terminated at a church called Saints Peter and Paul at the Triconch. It may seem rather counterintuitive to us to hold an outdoor public procession in the wake of an earthquake. But we must remember that pre-moderns would not have had the same scientific sensibility that we have today. Think of holding a supplicatory procession at the height of the coronavirus pandemic. Not wise. Let me also refer you to a very interesting study by Carlo Cipolla entitled Faith, Reason, and the Plague in 17th Century Tuscany, which recounts the conflict between a pre-modern and modern understanding of illness in a town near Florence. Now, by mimetic processions, on the other hand, I mean those which represent sacred events, like the procession on Palm Sunday in Jerusalem and later in Constantinople. I only have a picture here from a modern picture, of course, from Bucharest just last year ago. Another series of typologies is given by I.H. Dalmé, Irénée Henri Dalmé, speaking of both a cortege, as for example, a funeral procession and a parade. And finally, A.G. Martimore further divides them into memorials of events, like Palm Sundays, mimetic, functional, like funerals, pilgrimage, which we've talked about, lustration, which would be supplication, the Robigalia, which was the Roman pagan version of what became the Great Litany, and then finally Dalmé's cortege. Here's a cortege, right? The funeral cortege. So these are obviously, these ultimately have or can have great religious significance. It's a very, also a lot of, can be, and I'll come to this at the end of my lecture, can be a lot of fun if you look at the right-hand side of the screen, this is a jazz funeral procession in New Orleans. Another useful way of looking at typology has been very recently proposed by Leslie Brubaker and Tim Wickham Chris Wickham in a chapter entitled Processions, Power, and Community Identity, East and West. And I find this this is so recent that I've just read about it, but I think it's another good way of looking at how processions work. First of all, they say there's the intra-urban procession from church or a monument, for example, from the Forum of Constantine, as I'll mention later, to another church or monument within the city itself, or from outside of the city to inside the city, or vice versa. Earthquake processions involve people fleeing the city, going outside the city walls, and then enclosing the city protectively. And I'll have more to say about that. There's a good image of circumambulation. The liturgical processions in Constantinople. I've given you here a map. I'll repeat this map later, and another map a few slides down as well. You see it. I'm hoping my pointer is working here, but oops. I'm hoping my pointer is. There's Hagia Sophia is here, the Hippodrome, the Great Palace, which was attached really basically to Hagia Sophia, of course, a square, and the Hippodrome, or the race course, the great circus of Constantinople. And if you go out towards the main street of the city, you go this way out to the city, walls, and ultimately to the walls. One of the major ways to get in was the Golden Gate. Up here is a place that's a region that's called Blachernai, and this will become very important because I'm going to be talking about the relic of the Virgin's robe, which was kept in Blachernai. And then here is where the tomb right in the middle of the city, the tomb of Constantine was, along with relics of the apostles. Here's I found this a number of years ago. This is a modern reconstruction of the interior of Hagia Sophia. Of course, it does not look anything like that today, but you have the ambo, which is a towering ambo, here to the left center of the screen, and then the templon, which would have covered and enclosed the altar on the right side of the screen. I think it's a marvelous reconstruction. Here's another map of the city that I hope you'll find somewhat useful, a little easier to read than the first one. And you see once again Blachernai up at the top, right near the Golden Horn, and then down below the number one, of course, is Hagia Irene, and number two is the Great Church, or Hagia Sophia, and the Forum of Constantine along the main street. Here are some other reconstructive views of the city. You might find them helpful. I showed this slide once before, and it was a magnificent city. Right, here's another, and I find it very handy reconstruction. Here you have Hagia Sophia, then the great race course, the Forum of Constantine is there. And here's some more pictures from that reconstruction of Hagia Sophia. So let me issue a disclaimer here. I'm not going to be talking about the processions within a church like Hagia Sophia, and they're very important, either for the Divine Liturgy or for the Liturgy of the Hours. For the Great Entrance, of course, which is a procession that started in the external Scuophalachion and entered, as Father Robert Taft has shown, through the side door, unlike the processions that begin within our Byzantine churches today. That's been treated by the for the great entrance by the still unsurpassed volume of the history of the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, The Great Entrance by Robert Taft. For the little entrance, we now have, luckily, a translation of Juan Mateos's The Liturgy of the Word, the first volume in that history of the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. I will, however, deal with processions associated with entrance into the great church, namely with the office of the three antiphons and the Trisagion. So, with that, let me mention that. Let me now turn to a typical stational procession or liturgical procession in Constantinople, medieval Constantinople. I've counted in my research 68 liturgical processions in our major source, which is the 10th century Typicon of the Great Church. There may not have been that many processions in the 10th century. Why do I say that? Liturgical manuscripts tend to retain outdated information for the sake of the future. They did not have computer storage. So if you did not write something down, it would be lost. So liturgical manuscripts tend to contain outdated ceremonies because they wanted to keep a memory of them. Many of the processions originated in the great church, which I've shown, and terminated at various churches in the city or beyond its walls, sometimes at the army camp outside of the walls. 47 of the processions had an interim station at the Forum of Constantine. You can see at the left upper middle of this screen. Or at another church. The processions commonly followed this order. And so I'll take you through it very, very quickly. Here's what I'm calling a typical stational procession. It would start in the great church itself with the entrance of the patriarch at the end of morning prayer or orthros, starting with then a synopty. You're familiar with all of this terminology with the litany, and a concluding prayer, the deacon bidding peace, a prayer of blessing, inclination, like we have just before Holy Communion in the Divine Liturgy, and a procession to the third river in the nave. They were on the floor. There were marble rivers. They were in blue that ran through the church of Hagia Sophia, and then another litany and a concluding prayer, and then we're off on procession. Here we have psalmody with, for example, on September the 1st, the indiction or New Year's, the civic New Year in Constantinople. Psalms 1, 2, and 64 with the Troparion Katafuge kai dynamis. Then the procession would stop at the Forum of Constantine, and the Psalms would end with a glory to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit, a repetition of the Troparion and the Perisi. You may recognize in this the structure, now very much miniaturized, the structure of the Trisagion as we have it. The Troparion, the Trisagion repeated, then the glory to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit, and then the Troparion, and then the Perisi, the short ending. Readings were given at this station, right? There's a short service of readings, the Prokeimenon, as with the Divine Liturgy, Psalm 146, verse 5. The epistle was Colossians 3:12-16, and the Gospel, Luke 4:16-22. This was followed by, of course, the other form, the insistent litany or the ectini, and then once again a prayer of blessing. Then to the stational church, again we have the psalmody with the antiphonal Troparion, O great creator of great creator of all creation. And then finally at the stational church, as they enter for the Divine Liturgy, the Gloria Patri as above, prayer of entrance, the synapti again, and the Trisagion. All of what we do in today's liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, of course, is a miniaturized form of this, and it's a big part of my own research on the urban character of Christian worship. What was a citywide event has been miniaturized within our churches. A little bit about the terminology here. Excuse me. The verb litaniuein originally meant to supplicate, right? And litania originally meant supplication. Lite came to mean exclusively procession or liturgical procession. And that term was used from processions from at first in the 5th century, as far as I can tell. The reference to litania is always to processions that take place outdoors, as far as I know. Lite is a more technical term used in the Constantinopolitan sources to refer to processions, especially in the Typicon of the Great Church. It's also used by the historian Sodziman, for example, 5th century Sodziman, to describe processions during the affair of the statues in 4th century Antioch, great supplicatory processions that took place when the people tore down the imperial statues and were afraid of the retribution. So, by contrast, the imperial cortege, and that's the second down there on the bottom, the imperial cortege, or progress to the great church, was called either a proelefsis or a procensas. I'll not tarry with the regular liturgical processions held within the city. I want to deal just with occasional processions. One of them, however, was the frequent procession that met at the Forum of Constantine and moved to the great church. As I said, that's the origin of what we know as the office of 3 antiphons, at least that's my argument, following Matthäus, as well as the entrance into the great church, in which the Trisagion served as the antiphon to a longer psalm, Psalm 80. As with the introit antiphons in the Roman Rite, the bulk of the psalm verses eventually dropped out when the long processions did. A second regular procession took place weekly and involved processing with icons of the Theotokos on Friday nights from Blachernai at the northeast corner of the city walls to a church of the Theotokos close to Hagia Sophia called Chalcopertia. That's the bronze workers section area. This Friday night procession probably had its origins in the early 6th century. Now, one distinguishing aspect, and here's one of my main points, one distinguishing aspect of the processions in the Byzantine capital was what one might call their political nature. Many of the processions were a response to civil disasters, like the one you see on your screen, the procession on 25 September 438, in response to an earthquake, during which, according to legend, a boy appeared singing the Trisagion. In the same civic category can be included the procession and coronation of the emperor, which moved from outside the city, the Hebdomon, through the Golden Gate, down the Mese, Main Street, to the Church of St. Stephen in the Imperial Palace, and finally to Hagia Sophia. As you can see, the route here, from outside the city, way through the Mese, to finally to number 2 here, Hagia Sophia. The same kind of procession takes place on May 11th. Today's the vigil of May 11th, which was the anniversary liturgical commemoration of the foundation of the city. I want to spend a few moments with the idea of earthquake processions. I want to end acknowledging the 2018 Notre Dame dissertation by Mark Roussian, who's now at Yale's Institute of Sacred Music. This dissertation is entitled Liturgical Commemoration of Earthquakes in Late Antique Constantinople at the Intersection of Ritual, Environment, and Empire. And in the course of that, I was also alerted to a piece by the current dean of theology at Catholic University of America, Father Mark Morozovich, on a phenomenon of the connection between liturgy and natural disaster. Here's a liturgical procession that took place reaching the Church of the Theotokos Blachernai, commemorating the earthquake that took place in 740 on the 26th of October. There are 9, as a matter of fact, there are 9 earthquake commemorations chronicled in the Typicon of the Great Church. Earthquakes were obviously not uncommon in Constantinople, located as it was on the North Anatolian Fault. Rushian comes to the persuasive conclusion that, quote, and I'm quoting him, just as the city of Constantinople was beginning to understand itself as the center of the oikumene, world, in political terms, the church declared through earthquake commemorations that it was the center of the cosmos, the universe, in theological terms, but for its sins rather than its triumphs. The liturgical processions associated with earthquakes are an excellent example of supplicatory processions in which the people prayed for deliverance and forgiveness of their sins. Of course, for them, the earthquakes were a sign of divine wrath and displeasure. He also notes that the origins of these annual processions lay in the evacuation of the city by its inhabitants. The later annual commemorations could be interpreted as well as manifestations of divine favor, because the city was not destroyed, but came back to life. Think of the rebuilding that takes place after earthquakes, hurricanes, or other natural disasters today. Or think of a procession or a ceremony, at least that frames the civic identity of a city, much as the commemoration of 9/11, September 11th might in contemporary New York. Processions could also signal religious combat, like the rivalry between the Nicaeans and the Arians, described by both Socrates, the historian, and Sozomen during the episcopacy of St. John Chrysostom, or the public procession led by the Monophysite patriarch Timothy of Alexandria. This was, of course, an occasion of battle in the streets. The procession that marked the return of Chrysostom's relics is a fine example of the political and adversarial use of processions. Nathaniel Andrade enumerates 3 goals for Chrysostom's processional strategy: to bring a fiery light to a dark city, of course, torchlight, in the night, to transform imperial plazas and sites into sites inhabited by a Christian politia, and thirdly, to have John's congregation both invite and become a chorus of heavenly angels. Andrade concludes that, quote, with one fire, one spirit, one voice, John's followers transformed Constantine's most notable imperial spaces into a radiant image of heaven. Byzantine sources give lavish evidence of lavish processions of relics, very much like the Adventus. The deposition of relics of John Chrysostom in the Church of the Apostles on 27 January 438, as you can see in this slide. One of the most evocative descriptions given of a relic procession is given by John Chrysostom on the occasion of the arrival of the relics of Saint Phocas from Pontus, Asia Minor. Yesterday, he says, our city was aglow, radiant, and famous, not because it had colonnades, but because a martyr arrived in procession from Pontus. Let no one stay away from this holy assembly. Let no virgin stay shut up in her house, no woman keep to her own home. Let us empty the city and go to the grave of the martyr, where even the emperor and his wife go with us. Let us make of the sea a church once again, going forth to it with lamps. The scholar Wendy Mayer has pointed out that this and similar passages demonstrate that even the sea was made a processional or stational pathway in late antique Constantinople. Relic processions are, of course, a very good example of what I have called personage-centered processions. Now, since time forbids my going into the numerous processions that relate to what we usually regard as the liturgical year, I'm going to limit myself to one other procession, a procession that has a curious afterlife. Some processions commemorated the salvation of the city from foreign attacks. A fine example is the procession to the shrine at the Palace of Blachernai, which I've mentioned a couple of times, at the northeast corner of the city. When the Avars laid siege to the city in 626 and the Emperor Heraclius with the army was fighting the Persians elsewhere, it was the robe of the Theotokos that kept at this shrine, which according to legend saved the city. See, here's an icon of the deposition of the robe of the Theotokos at Blachernai. The Patriarch Sergius paraded the relic around the city walls, and the attackers fell back in disarray. This legendary miraculous event, was celebrated at Blachernai on July the 2nd. The chant accompanying the procession reveals how central the patronage of the Mother of God was to Constantinople. Mother of God, ever virgin, protector of all peoples, you have given to your city your robe and cincture as sure protection. By your virginal conception, you remained incorruptible. For in you, time and nature have entered a new way, and so we beg you, give peace to our empire and to our souls great mercy. Now, the gospel passage assigned to that day was appropriately Luke 1:39 to 56. That is to say, the story of the scene of the visitation, together with the Theotokos, Mary's song of praise, the Magnificat. Now, what do I mean by curious afterlife? The curious afterlife is the fact that this observance was translated to the West in the 14th century. In the calendar of the pre-Vatican II Roman liturgy, it became the Feast of the Visitation. Treatments of the Marian feasts have neglected its Byzantine origins because its local nature did not make sense to them. A good case, if ever there was, for comparative liturgy. Before I turn to relevance, let me quote my own conclusion with regard to liturgical processions in the life of the city of Constantinople. Christianity represented the public religious life of the city by means of its cult, its liturgy. It made the civitas, the city, not only civilization, but holy civilization. A civilization defended as much by icons and relics and processions as by walls and military and political power. Thus, the city as a holy civilization was a concept that was expressed above all liturgically. Now, relevance. I hope that my presentation thus far has been at least somewhat instructive as a description and analysis of how one city virtually became a church, and that its liturgical processions, to use a phrase from Leslie Brubaker and Chris Wickham, quote, created rivers of public space. I like that. Created rivers of public space. Now, but does what we have learned here have some relevance for us today? Particularly, let me say, for Eastern Christians. I think that all things being equal, and I do admit that the devil is in the social and cultural details, like dealing, for example, with public health emergencies, I do think that liturgical outdoor processions can have some relevance today. We should not neglect the power of processions to unite the political and religious elements of our lives. Here's a procession in a city street, right? It's in Washington, D.C. Here's one in Ukraine after the takeover of Crimea in 2016. which has both, of course, religious and political, in the wider sense of the word, political resonance. Having written a fair amount about processions, I learned this lesson vividly when I participated in a march, or maybe procession, from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley to Sproul Plaza at the University of California, Berkeley, to protest U.S. involvement in the oppressive Salvadoran regime. This was in the mid-1980s. Even though we had no crosses or candles, the fact that we were using repetitive religious chants awakened me to the genius of processions. In Chrysostom's contest with the Arians, it was the silver crosses provided by the empress, as well as the superiority of the liturgical chants of the Orthodox that won the day. While Christian processions through our cities today may seem more like a curiosity than anything else, like the Hare Krishna processions one used to see, liturgical processions are a way of claiming that Christianity is not a private religion catering to individual tastes, but rather represents a faith that claims to proclaim Jesus Christ as the Savior of all humanity. Needless to say, liturgical processions will be context-specific. Large cities or villages or larger towns all pose diverse challenges to their implementation. Even, of course, weather is a consideration. You're going to have more processions in milder climates, and you will have more processions in fairer weather. If we refuse, however, the challenge to adapt the venerable Christian practice of outdoor processions, we truly run the risk of becoming what I like to call God's frozen people. In this vein, let me briefly enumerate 7 important functions that outdoor liturgical processions perform, and this is how I will end. They do not perform all of these functions at the same time, but they do overlap. Number 1, liturgical processions can be political in the broadest sense of the word. I think of the clergy leadership of the Selma marches. Here you see some clergy and religious, the Selma marches of 1965, or the possibility of more specific participation in processing to counter unfair anti-immigration policies, or attitudes of racism, or, of course, the right to life. And here's a procession with an icon in a right to life procession. You realize that I'm using the religious and liturgical processions somewhat loosely, but that's my point. Such activity can be controversial, politically controversial and fraught, but what's the alternative? What's the alternative? An impotent faith that cringes in fear of a wider world, that retreats into a private space? Like many rituals, processions can serve to reinforce our identity as Christians, like the holy name parades of my youth back in New Jersey, or the great Anglo-Catholic congresses of the early 20th century in England. Perhaps I can make a negative analogy, because sometimes their processions meet and conflict, as in Constantinople, a negative analogy to the various conflicting parades, processions, which reinforced Catholic or Protestant identity in Northern Ireland, at least in the past. Hopefully that is the past. Let me qualify that immediately, since I'm certainly not advocating counter-denominational processions, but simply using these as an analogy. Let me speculate that processions might be a way also of coming together in an ecumenically irenic way for Eastern Christians and the Orthodox to show common witness. I'll let you think up examples for yourselves. Fourthly, as all of our liturgical activity should be, liturgical processions can be manifestations, or, to use that wonderful word that's used by Father Schmemann so often, epiphanies of the reign of God. In other words, they are more about God's future present now, or eschatology, than they are about nostalgia for the past. Given the eschatological nature of Christian faith and worship, liturgical processions express the dynamism of faith in the future God holds out for us. It's no accident that all of our liturgies have traditionally involved so much movement both indoors and out of doors. Christianity, and here, of course, is a Western Catholic procession on Corpus Christi in a northern Italian alpine town. And then another one here, this is a town, but here's one in a city, and this is actually by an Episcopal church in Times Square, near Times Square in New York, going through, of course, Times Square. Christianity is, at least should be, or we should honor it as, a dynamic living faith, or else it is moribund. Lastly, and I can argue not least, outdoor liturgical processions can be simply enjoyable. Some cranky and dour early church writers complained that the nocturnal processions for the festivals of the martyrs could be an occasion for hanky-panky. Today, I would call them spoil sports. But Christian faith can be a source of immense joy. After all, we place our trust in a risen Lord who has conquered sin and death. What better reason for joy? Why not express that faith far and wide, even outdoors? I can't think of a better way to end, and so I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Father John. At this time, we'd like to invite viewers to ask any follow-up questions. Father John will be with us for a bit longer to answer them. To ask a question, use the YouTube chat box on the right side of your screen. And if you're watching on the seminary website, click the green watch from YouTube button or watch on YouTube button below the video to get over to the right place. So while we're waiting for those to come in, we'd like to invite the seminarians who are watching on campus to jump in with their questions to get things started.
Just hold it up right there.
Thank you for your presentation, Father. I wonder if you could comment. It seems that the processions largely developed in the context of a more explicitly Christian culture and city, and I'm wondering if you could comment on the importance of processions as we hear about how the non-affiliated are rising, and certainly we don't have an explicitly Christian secular order in our day and in our country.
Thank you very much. That's a great question because it goes exactly to what I'm trying to argue. It seems to me that in our post-Christian culture, basically we're living in a post-Christian culture, right? Depending on where you are, you might be living in a town that's very, has a lot of active Christians. But in our post-Christian culture, something like that slide that I showed of the procession through Times Square, it's a witness to our faith. I think the processing outdoors is a great witness to the faith. It's obviously very public, and any kind of procession, can be met with criticism but at least people tend to look. They tend not to ignore it, right? Like as with parades, they tend not to ignore it. So I think that's, for me, that's all the more reason to why what made the last part about the relevance of it, because the history is fascinating in its own right? It's fascinating history, and it does tell us a lot about the development of our liturgies. But here, in other places I've worked at, I've written about Jerusalem and Rome. They had their own systems, but here especially, how much the liturgy of the city of Constantinople affected the development of the divine liturgy as we know it today. So thanks for that question.
Okay, there's still no questions that have come through on YouTube at this point, so we'll still give it a little more time. If the seminarians have some other questions, then feel free to ask them now.
I have the feeling that I overwhelmed you with data. That's the danger of a lecture like this.
There you go.
Thank you, Father John, for your presentation. I have a simple question. I'm curious if we have a sense of how long these processions were in Constantinople.
That's good. Thank you. That's something I avoided. Thank you very much. Because I don't know the answer. Now, they must have taken a long time, and we do have sources that say that, but it's probably an exaggeration that the whole city took part in them. Think of that quote I gave you from the procession of the martyr from Focus, the St. John Chrysostom, the quote I gave you from that. He says, the entire city turned out, right? Let everybody go to the martyr's grave. Well, it's hard to imagine that everybody would, but they didn't have computers or smartphones to occupy their attention. They didn't have TVs at home. They didn't have, this is public life, and in an ancient city, a lot of public life was lived in public. So you could imagine that these would be very popular and very participatory. Now, the processions from, I would say I tried to think out I've only ever been to Istanbul once, and was not able to take a walk from what would have been the site of the Forum of Constantine to Hagia Sophia. But I imagine that procession would have taken about the better part of an hour. They were not in a hurry. As I say, they didn't have a TV program to go home to or something. They weren't in a hurry. So that those who were committed to it, you all may be familiar with the material, the Jerusalem material in Egeria, when the great pilgrimage of Egeria in the late 4th century. Those services took hours and hours and hours and hours. Now, we don't know how many people, now there were a lot of pilgrims there, participated in them, but we can imagine that it was a significant number of people. That's the best guess I can make. Yeah.
Okay, we got a question that came through on the YouTube chat. Someone asks, is there a danger of a religious procession in today's society becoming more of a spectacle than a testament of faith?
Yes, of course there is. There's always that danger. But you have to, yes, of course. But you have to weigh the danger against the benefit, right? Is the benefit just staying within our walls and well, I'll use a loaded word here, hiding? That's the danger, it seems to me. And so, yes, I mean, some people, of course, would criticize, public processions. There's going to be public processions. I'm sure you're familiar with the Eucharistic revival that's going on in the U.S. Now, and I guess in the summer of a year from now, 2024, in which there's a great deal being made of processing the Blessed Sacrament and through various places, all processions meeting in Indianapolis, I guess it is, where the final Congress will be held. Is there a spectacle element to that? Yes, I suppose there is. But it's also meant to be a witness of faith, our faith in the Lord and in the Eucharistic Lord. But I'll grant the point, sure.
Okay, I don't see any other questions coming in from YouTube. Although, here comes another one. Somebody asks, I'm wondering if I'm going to mispronounce it, eschatological value, more visible in miniaturized, compacted indoor rites, was present in earlier outdoor processions.
Good question. Well, the eschatological dimension, I think I understand where the question is coming from, because in our indoor spaces, in your Byzantine spaces or Eastern Christian spaces, far more than in our, unfortunately, Reformed Western Catholic spaces, the eschatological looms large. It's hard to avoid heaven on earth in a well-constructed, beautiful Byzantine church. That's true. But It seems to me that it's not as obvious. You make a good point. It's a good question. It's not as obvious in the outdoors, but at the same time, in a sense, we are redeeming creation. That is to say, or acknowledging the fact that creation has been redeemed by God, because the eschatological realities, right, the reign of God is for the world, is for the whole world, not just for us in our limited spaces. But yes, the eschatology comes out so much more clearly in a beautiful Byzantine church.
Great, thank you. I think that's it for the YouTube questions, but we did get a lot of positive comments sprinkled in there, people saying they really enjoyed your presentation. There's one more that came in. The user asks, can you perhaps give us an example of a possible coming together in an ecumenically ironic way for Eastern Catholics and Orthodox in procession type settings?
Yes, good. Palm Sunday. This is done not only, but could be done not only with Eastern Catholics and Orthodox, but across the board. I know, for example, in Rome, one of the English-speaking church, the Jesuit English-speaking church called the Caravita, used to sponsor a procession. They met in a piazza with the Methodists, the Anglicans, the Lutherans. I don't know if Eastern Orthodox were there. And they had a kind of liturgy of the word and blessing of the palms, and then they all processed to their own churches. Now, there's some division there because they can't celebrate the Eucharist together, but at least it was a sign of trying to do that together. Or where there is now, I don't know the situation, and fools rush in where angels fear to tread. In Ukraine, whether the Orthodox Ukrainian Church and the Greek Catholic Church could participate in a supplicatory procession for the end of the war, presumably for victory. But I don't know the political situation well enough to know whether that's possible. But those are the kinds of things I would think of. Yeah.
Great. There's a couple more that came in as you're answering those. Next one is, how does one understand the astrological realities and the different elements of Byzantine and Roman liturgy?
Oh my, that's another hour-long lecture. How do I understand the eschatological elements? Is that it?
Astrological realities in the different elements of the two liturgies, Roman and Byzantine.
Well, obviously, I'm not sure where the question is coming from, but obviously the eschatological is far more visible and focused in Eastern liturgies than it is in the West, right? Heaven on earth, it's much easier to make that claim, to appreciate it. But it's there, very much there in the Western liturgies, but we don't pay much attention to it. It's in our prayers. And it should be more, we all do the Sanctus, the Holy, 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 right? That's the song of the angels that we join in the heavenly choruses, etc. That's a very eschatological element in the liturgy. There's always the prayer that the reality of the Eucharist in the epiclesis, which is called down upon not only the holy gifts, but upon the congregation itself, that it may become, as we say in our beautiful Eucharistic Prayer 3 in the Roman Rite, one body, one spirit in Christ. That's an eschatological element. I'd have to take more time to think about more elements, but as I say, it could be another lecture. Yeah.
Okay, here's another one. Were typological connections ever made to the Jewish practices of Sukkot in the singing of the Psalms 120 through 134 as the pilgrims came to the temple in Jerusalem?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I didn't go into any of that material, and that's a very good observation. Yes, I mean, the same kind of processions, right? The three great processional feasts, as I mentioned, the word Hag in Hebrew, which is related to Hajj in Islam, these are feasts of procession and pilgrimage, and Sukkot was the same kind of thing, right? And so there are many processional psalms. I'm taking it. I'm taking it on faith, given the psalms that you mentioned, that the questioner mentioned. But yes, has a detailed study been done of it? Not that I know of, but since I don't know everything, it's possible that has happened. But not that I know of. But it would be a great task, a great subject to pursue.
All right, I think that's it from the YouTube chat. Are there any other questions from the seminarians on campus? I don't think so. So thanks again, Father John, for your time. And before we wrap things up, we'd like to bring back Father Christian for some closing remarks.
Just wanted to, on behalf of, again, the Archbishop, the Rector, and all those who are faculty at St. Cyril and Methodius Seminary, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you very much, Father John, for bringing your many years of liturgical research and teaching to us. As you know, the Byzantine Church throughout the world is very, very interested, especially these days since the Council, in liturgy. So we couldn't have asked for a better topic to interest the seminarians as well as the MAT students here at Cyril and Methodius, not to mention our guests who often in person, when the lecturers in person are here, to hear what they love most, which is the celebration of the divine offices. So with that said, thank you everyone for being present, and I hope you have a blessed evening. Christ is risen.
Thank you.